With rising economic and military strength, Hitler was able to conduct a more assertive foreign policy. It helped that Britain was sympathetic to many German demands, especially that Germans should live in Germany. In addition, Britain and France were often divided on how to respond to Germany's actions, and few states were willing to work diplomatically with the Soviet Union for any purpose, much less the isolation of Germany. Finally, Italy's relationship with Britain and France was permanently damaged by the Abyssinian crisis, preventing a united front against Nazi Germany while giving Germany the chance to gain a diplomatic partner. The Rhineland was a large territory of German territory that bordered Belgium, France, and Luxembourg. This zone was demilitarized at the end of the First World War to create a buffer between Germany and its western neighbors, so that if there was a future war, France and Belgium would be warned far ahead of time. Germany saw the demilitarized zone as a vulnerability since France could potentially invade Germany with no resistance until French armies were deep inside the country. Being unable to control its territory was also a national humiliation. It seems that there were plans by Germany to potentially reoccupy the Rhineland in 1937, but the favorable diplomatic situation created by the Abyssinian crisis persuaded Hitler to act in March of 1936. Even as early as December 1935, the German army was ordered to start planning for this reoccupation. Crucial to the success of Hitler's plan was the attitude of Italy. Mussolini was isolated from Britain and France because of Italy's invasion of Abyssinia, and this assured Hitler that Mussolini would not cooperate with the British and French in imposing the remilitarization of the Rhineland. German troops entered the Rhineland on March 7, 1936. To reassure France that they did not intend to violate the Franco-German frontier, they were initially few in number and lightly equipped. France did not move to intervene, partly because the French border had not been violated and there was little support in either France or Britain for preventing Germany from controlling its own territory. The French army had planned only for a defensive war against future German aggression, with the assumption that Germany would attack along its shared border, not through the demilitarized Rhineland. There were no military plans for opposing Germany anywhere other than at the French border. The French government refused to fight Germany alone, and Britain made it clear it was unwilling to go to war over the Rhineland. Military spending, however, was increased. The British government did reassure France that in the event of an unprovoked German attack on French territory, it would send troops to France. British public opinion was convinced that Hitler was merely walking into his own back garden. In fact, the British government was pleased at the reoccupation of the Rhineland because it removed a major German grievance against Britain and France and meant that France could no longer threaten Germany with invasion. Britain hoped that Germany would now be more cooperative. Many in Britain saw Germany as a bulwark against communism. The remilitarization of the Rhineland was a triumph for Hitler. There was a feeling in Europe that Germany was now the center of European power. It was clear that the Treaty of Versailles was no longer being followed or would not be altered further. Germany was emerging as an economic and military power. The invasion of Abyssinia led to severely strained relations between Italy and its former diplomatic partners, Britain and France. Italy and Germany, both isolated diplomatically, now began to closer diplomatic relationship to end this state of affairs and challenge British and French domination of international affairs. Germany was clearly an anti-communist state, leading to further opportunities to end its isolation from international affairs. In October 1936, a new diplomatic relationship between Germany and Italy was announced. This became known as the Rome-Berlin Axis, indicating the desire or dream of this new diplomatic alignment that world affairs be determined by governments of Italy and Germany, not London and Paris. This was a clear announcement that Britain and France were no longer to be states that determined international affairs and events, and that Italy and Germany were instead to replace them in importance. Hitler's government agreed with Japan in November 1936 to oppose the Soviet-sponsored organization of the Communist International, otherwise known as the Comintern. This organization was responsible for supporting communist groups around the world, which included groups in Spain that were fighting German-sponsored nationalists and the Chinese Communist Party that fought Japan and China. The agreement did not specifically mention cooperative work against the Soviet Union, but this was clearly implied. The pact was primarily symbolic for both Japan and Germany, in that it was a declaration that neither was diplomatically isolated and that they would cooperate in future international diplomacy. Being against communism was something most world governments could claim, so it was also a cause which most governments would not oppose or become alarmed about. Italy joined the pact in November 1937. After the failed attempt to take control of Austria in 1934, Austria worked to prevent annexation by trying to negotiate with Germany. In February 1938, Hitler demanded that the Austrian government appoint an Austrian Nazi Party member, Arthur Incourt, as Minister of Public Security. This ministry was in charge of all police. In addition, all jailed Nazi Party members had to be released. Austria complied, only to have Hitler publicly denounce Austrian independence, stating that millions of Germans were suppressed by being separated from Germany. Hitler's government announced in Germany that riots had broken out against the Austrian government and that there was a need for German forces to enter Austria to restore order. The Austrian government was commanded to turn over all authority to the Austrian Nazi Party officials or face an invasion on March 11th. The leader of Austria, Schuschnigg, resigned as chancellor to prevent bloodshed and was replaced by Incourt. Incourt immediately sent a message to Germany's government asking for Germany's military to restore public order, although there was no disorder in Austria. On March 12th, German forces entered the country, and on March 13th, Austria was officially annexed to Germany in violation of the Treaty of Saint-Germain. An April plebiscite confirmed the annexation with over 99% of voters approving. Since German troops had been invited to enter Austria by its legal government and the voters had apparently approved the merger of the two states, the practically defunct League of Nations did not react. Okay, this is a quick 1-minute history of the Spanish Civil War, which should be an entire topic in a normal year, but this is not a normal year. So, in 1936, the Spanish army essentially revolted against the elected government. The nationalists, who were the army, supporters of the Catholic Church, and other conservatives, fought the Republicans, a group that included socialists, Republicans, anti-church groups, and communists. Germany and Italy supported the nationalists, while the Soviets backed the Republicans. Britain and France supported neither side and insisted on an arms embargo. Germany and Italy agreed to the embargo but continued to support and even fight for the nationalists. As the Republicans were gradually destroyed, the Soviets grew more convinced that Britain and France believed in their own security far more than they did in collective security, even though Spain belonged to the League of Nations. Further, the Soviets understood that the British and the French opposed communism more than fascism, and so they could not be reliable partners to oppose the policy of fascist states. Germany primarily provided supplies to nationalist forces, although German-piloted aircraft did participate in some of the battles of the war. Germany's primary desire was to prolong the Spanish Civil War since Spain lay along France's southern border. Germany hoped that France might eventually become involved in the conflict, which would mean a reduction of military forces along their shared border and perhaps a diplomatic weakening of France generally. Historian H.T.P. Taylor went so far as to say that Hitler was disappointed when the Spanish Civil War ended with the nationalist victory in 1939, since that ended the possibility of France becoming mired in the conflict. The international response to Anschluss was muted, primarily because France was more concerned with Spain. Britain's Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain noted in a speech that British officials had indicated their displeasure over Germany's action to the German government. He also stated that there was next to nothing Britain or any other country could have done to prevent the annexation. Many in Britain and France continued to believe that a strengthened Germany would be useful in any future conflict against what they perceived as the real threat, communism, and therefore the Soviet Union. Additionally, few could see the point of preventing Germans from living in Germany, even if this came through expansion. Britain and France could have done little militarily since there were no plans of any type, and neither had sufficient military might to force any changes. Germany was surely aware of this. The policy of working with Germany to ease various conditions of the Treaty of Versailles, as well as allowing it to absorb German areas such as Austria, is known primarily as appeasement. Appeasement is often seen as giving Hitler the impression that Britain and France were eager to allow him to do whatever he wanted in Central and Eastern Europe so that they could avoid war. Some historians continue to hold this as some truth. Most modern historians see the policy of appeasement as much more complex and based on diplomatic strategies from earlier periods. The British government in the late 1930s saw appeasement as normal diplomacy. It believed that negotiating made a lot more sense than threatening Germany militarily, especially since Britain did not have the military capability to attack Germany until 1939. In addition, many saw most of Germany's demands as reasonable right up until September 1st, 1939. Why should Germans not live in Germany? Why not renegotiate borders that were artificial and in some cases created only in 1919? While the British government may have seen these demands as reasonable, there may be some truth in the claims that Hitler viewed Britain and France as weak as a result of negotiating. Hitler, however, believed long before that these states were fundamentally weak simply because they were democratic. The Soviet Union could also only protest as its government was in disarray. A series of purges began within the Soviet government in 1934. These intensified so that in a period of 1937 to 38, at least 700,000 people were executed and approximately 1.5 million were imprisoned. Many people in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs had been killed in the purge, including many ambassadors, heads of departments, secretaries, and deputy ministers. What this meant was that the experts on various foreign issues were now mostly dead, along with those who had worked to build relations with France and Britain to oppose Germany's foreign policy. Although France and the Soviet Union had signed an agreement in 1935 to mutually assist each other, this agreement had meant little. No military talks ever occurred, which meant that any use of force against Germany was unlikely or even impossible. France was also divided by weak coalition governments, and many in France were completely opposed to communism. The British government was clearly weary of working with the Soviet Union as they were more sympathetic to Germany. Part of this sympathy was based on a fear of communism generally and the Soviet Union in particular. The purges shocked many in both Britain and France and reminded them of what they viewed as the destructive and dangerous nature of communism. The purges helped ensure that neither Britain nor France would work with the Soviets to oppose Germany. With Germany's annexation of Austria, there was renewed agitation by Germans in Czechoslovakia to be included in the expanding, prosperous Germany. Over 3 million Germans lived in Czechoslovakia, and the main German political party, the Sudeten German Party, demanded autonomy for the Sudeten area of Czechoslovakia, where most of the Germans lived. Excited about Anschluss, many saw the opportunity for a Sudetenland to join Germany in a way similar to what had happened in Austria. Konrad Heinlein, head of the Sudeten German Party, met Hitler in Berlin at the end of March 1938. A week later, he presented a list of demands called the Carlsbad Program. The main aim of the demands was German autonomy within Czechoslovakia. While the Czechoslovakian government was willing to give Sudeten Germans more rights, it was not willing to allow self-government. This was seen as practical independence. The world, after witnessing the recent annexation of Austria, understood clearly that Germany was using Heinlein's party as a tool to take control of Sudeten. The Sudeten was critically important for Czechoslovakia's advanced economy, as it was a source of metals and other mined products. In addition, bordering Germany, the Sudeten was located of the main defenses against an invasion from Germany. If the government were to lose control over this region, the country would be defenseless in the face of an invasion. To demonstrate its determination not to lose control of its territory, the country's military was partially mobilized for war at the end of May, when it seemed Germany might attack. No attack occurred. But Czechoslovakia had demonstrated that, unlike Austria, it was willing to fight. Unlike the earlier issue with Austria, foreign states were involved with the Sudeten crisis from the start. Czechoslovakia had alliances with France and the Soviet Union. Only a minority of its population was German, unlike Austria. Again, unlike Austria, Czechoslovakia had a modern, well-equipped military, and its industrial capacity was important. If the country's industries and mineral resources were added to those of Germany, it would only expand its already impressive economy and allow further, faster rearmament. Understanding the international response is critically important to overall understanding of the outcome of the Sudeten crisis. France had a military alliance with Czechoslovakia and therefore was alarmed at the possibility of war. Its Eastern European alliances had been created by the French government to apply pressure on Germany so that there would be no further attack on France. France had never planned for that alliance to mean that they might have to defend a state in Central Europe. There was no possibility of France intervening militarily as it was engaged in developing its defensive line and producing weapons. France was not ready for a confrontation. France reached out to Britain to help resolve the crisis. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union and Czechoslovakia had a mutual defense treaty since 1935. This was aligned with the Mutual Assistance Treaty between France and the Soviet Union. If France moved to fulfill its military obligations to Czechoslovakia as part of the Little Entente treaties signed in 1921, then the Soviets, in support of France, would also help Czechoslovakia if it were attacked. The Soviets pledged to support Czechoslovakia if France would move militarily to prevent an attack on the country by Germany. This gesture was mostly a hollow one since the French government did not intend on going to war over Czechoslovakia, nor did it want to cooperate with the communist Soviet state. In addition, with the purges in the Soviet military and the fact that a powerful Poland stood between the Soviet Union and Germany, France was aware that the Soviet pledges were essentially meaningless. As with the Rhineland and Austria, many in Britain believed that there was little reason for Germans not to live in Germany. Germans, like other minority populations in Czechoslovakia, were certainly discriminated against, and so there was some sympathy with German demands. Britain, like France, was simply not willing to go to war over the borders of any Central or Eastern European state. In the midst of substantial rearmament, Britain, even if willing, was not yet in a position where pressure could be applied to Germany. Massive pressure, however, was placed on the government of Czechoslovakia to agree to the demands of Heinlein and his party in the hope that this would indeed prevent an outbreak of war. In July, France informed Czechoslovakia's government that France would not go to war to prevent the loss of Sudeten. Britain sent a minister, Lord Rockingham, to demand the government comply with as many of the Sudeten German demands as possible. While the Czechoslovak government considered how to respond, Germany mobilized 750,000 troops to conduct maneuvers on their mutual border in an attempt to force more concessions. Finally, in early September, Czechoslovakia's government gave in to most of Sudetenland demands. This did not resolve the situation as Heinlein was under orders from Hitler to prevent any overall agreement. It was critical that no resolution be found so that the Sudeten would have to be occupied by Germany's military in order to quell disturbances, as had happened in Austria. Therefore, a crisis was created when two prominent members of the Sudeten German party were arrested during violent demonstrations, falsely claiming that Czechoslovakia had committed various atrocities against Germans in the country. Heinlein ended all talks with the government. Hitler soon announced that Czechoslovakia should be broken up as a state and that there were plans to exterminate all Germans living in that country. On the 13th of September, British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain flew to Germany to discuss the Sudeten crisis directly with Hitler. He hoped that a reasonable solution could be found to the crisis so that war could be averted. After the meeting, he returned to Britain to meet with the French Prime Minister. Both Chamberlain and Daladier agreed that areas of Czechoslovakia that held populations that were more than 50% German should be ceded to Germany. This was initially rejected by Czechoslovakia, but on the 21st of September, the Czech government had decided that this was the only way to avoid war. Almost immediately, Hitler made new demands. Areas of Czechoslovakia that held large Hungarian and Polish populations should be given to Hungary and Poland. He also stated that German troops should immediately occupy Sudeten. Britain and France rejected these new demands, and the countries began to prepare for war. Hitler realized he may have overstepped the mark. He did not desire war with Britain and France, not to mention Czechoslovakia. Yet he did not back down, as he believed that France and Britain would eventually capitulate. He ordered the army to prepare to invade the Sudeten, finally settling on October 1st for this to occur. Mussolini was also alarmed, as Italy was Germany's ally and might be dragged into a conflict for which it was clearly not prepared. Mussolini called for a meeting between the leaders of Italy, Germany, Britain, and France. This was held in Munich, Germany, on September 28th. Czechoslovakia was not invited to attend, nor was the Soviet Union. An agreement was reached in the early hours of the next morning. The Munich Agreement stated, among other things, that Germany was to receive the Sudeten from Czechoslovakia, that German troops would occupy the region, that plebiscites would be held to determine in which country residents wished to be citizens. German troops were to be released from Czechoslovakian military service, and an international commission would resolve disputed areas. Czechoslovakia was bluntly informed by Britain and France that if it did not implement the Munich Agreement, it would fight Germany alone. Czechoslovakia complied. Also on September 30th, Chamberlain succeeded in obtaining Hitler's agreement to what is known as the Anglo-German Declaration. This was a statement that Germany and Britain would not go to war to resolve problems. Instead, each state pledged to consult the other over issues that might lead to conflict and to resolve those through dialogue. The French public was predominantly in favor of the Munich Agreement, and large crowds greeted the Prime Minister since war had been avoided. Yet France was weakened by the Sudeten crisis. Czechoslovakia, one of its main allies, had been sacrificed for France's own safety, and this sacrifice could only strengthen Germany in the long term. France had proven to the Soviets that the mutual assistance guarantee had little value and could not be relied on if Germany attacked the Soviet Union. France had aligned its policies with those of Britain during the crisis, although Britain continued to refuse to agree to a permanent military alliance. This would soon change. But France, for the time being, assumed no alliance would be forthcoming. In short, an isolated France had no choice but to follow where Great Britain led diplomatically. France's government was well aware of its increased insecurity and increased military spending by 300% in November 1938. In addition, France and Germany signed the Franco-German Declaration in December of 1938, pledging to peace and respecting each other's borders. The British public was also enthusiastic about avoiding war and proud of its government's role in resolving the crisis. Britain had negotiated what seemed to be a permanent settlement and had accomplished this while not fully rearmed and without any significant allies. Britain was aware, however, that France was now quite isolated and might work to reach some agreement with Germany to save itself from a future conflict. Furthermore, Germany had come close to using its military to force a resolution to the crisis, and so British rearmament continued, now at an accelerated pace. The Soviet Union had been ignored, neglected, and dismissed throughout the entire crisis. More than ever, the Soviet government realized that Britain and France were willing to accommodate fascist states such as Italy and Germany. The main fear was that Britain and France would not oppose Germany if that state attempted a major attack on the Soviet Union. They might even join with Germany in that event. It certainly did not escape the Soviets that their military was in a terrible state as a result of the recent purges. The Soviet Union was aware of its isolation, faced with Japan in the east and an ever-strengthening Germany in the west. It is clear that Hitler was relieved that war with France and Britain had not erupted over the Sudeten crisis. He had gambled that Britain and France would back down, and they did. He had been, it seems, prepared for a short war with Czechoslovakia, if necessary. After the annexation, though, of the Sudeten, his military experts inspected Czechoslovakia's fortification systems and decided that it was fortunate that war had not occurred, because victory might not have been achieved swiftly or perhaps at all, as the defenses were quite formidable. Hitler's popularity soared in Germany as a result of the annexation of the Sudeten, and because war was avoided. The popularity saved him from a plot by military officers to assassinate him and end Nazi government. The plotters feared public reaction, as he was now proclaimed a great hero. Meanwhile, Czechoslovakia was dismantled rapidly. On March 14, 1939, Czechoslovakian President Emil Hácha was summoned to meet Hitler in Berlin. He was told either Czechoslovakia would be invaded by Germany immediately, or he could agree as the country's leader to becoming a part of Germany with some autonomy over its own affairs. He signed over the country's independence to prevent a feudal war, and Slovakia was declared an independent country allied to Germany. Territories that had been taken from Germany in 1923 were now returned. The Munich Agreement, with all its hopes for peace, was completely undone in only 6 months.